Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.
Rain hissed through the torn roof of the wooden cage like venom through teeth. Each drop hit the mud below with a sound that might have been patience dying. Jax Reeve didn't move. Couldn't really, not with his wrists chained to the post behind him and his legs buried ankle-deep in cold, sucking filth that smelled like rot and old blood. The cage swayed when the wind picked up, groaning on its rusted hinges, and somewhere above him, laughter rolled down like stones. "So that's a human?" A young warrior tilted his head, squinting through the rain. "Looks smaller than the stories." A rock hit the bars with a crack. Jax's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. The warriors circled closer, their breath steaming in the cold, their eyes bright with the kind of cruelty that comes easy when you've never lost anything that mattered. Maybe he's already dead and just doesn't know it yet. More stones. Jax kept his eyes on the ground, counting heartbeats, measuring the distance between breaths. He'd been in worse places. Not many, but a few, and he'd learned a long time ago that panic was a luxury you couldn't afford when the walls were closing in. Then the laughter stopped. The crowd parted like water around a stone and she stepped through. Ilara. He'd heard the name whispered in the village when they dragged him here, spoken with something between fear and reverence, like a prayer you weren't sure would save you. She was tall, maybe 6.5 feet, shoulders broad enough to carry armor without flinching. Scars ran down her arms in pale, twisted lines, old enough to have stories, deep enough to have hurt. Her skin was the color of deep ocean water, mottled with darker patches along her jaw and collarbone. And her eyes, silver gray, sharp as broken glass, swept over him with the kind of focus that made his pulse kick up despite himself. She didn't laugh, didn't speak, just stood there, rain streaming down her face, one hand resting on the haft of her spear. The weapon was brutal in its simplicity. Black wood, iron tip, edges worn smooth by use. It looked like it had killed before. It looked like it wanted to kill again. The other warriors stepped back, waited. Ilara moved closer, boots squelching in the mud, until the spear tip hovered an inch from Jax's chest. He could see the metal trembling slightly, not from her hand, but from the vibration of the rain against it. She tilted her head, studying him the way you might study an insect pinned to a board. "Tell me, little man," she said, voice low and rough, like gravel scraped across iron. "Did you come to spy, or just to beg?" He met her gaze, didn't look away. His voice came out raw, scraped thin by thirst and exhaustion, but steady. "I came to warn you." Silence, the rain hammered harder. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the valley like a drumbeat. Her lips curled into something that might have been a smile if smiles could draw blood, then die knowing no one listened. The spear pressed forward, not hard, just enough to dimple the fabric of his shirt, enough to remind him how easy it would be, how fast. One thrust and he'd be another body in the mud, another story no one remembered. But then the thunder cracked overhead, so loud it shook the cage, and for just a second, one heartbeat, maybe two, something flickered in her eyes. Curiosity or fear. Even she didn't know which. They left him there as the storm rolled in, black and hungry, swallowing the sky. The rain turned the valley into a churning gray blur, and the cage became an island in a sea of mud. Jax leaned his head back against the post, closed his eyes, and listened to the world drown. He didn't sleep. Sleep was another luxury. Instead, he thought about the ridge, the black ridge across the valley, where the rocks jutted up like broken teeth and the shadows moved in ways shadows shouldn't. He'd seen the Skullbreakers plant the charges 2 days ago, working in pairs, silent as ghosts, burying the explosives in the narrow pass. He'd watched through his scope from half a kilometer away, counting heads, memorizing faces, mapping the kill zone in his mind. And then he'd come here, stupid maybe, suicidal probably. But the alternative was watching another massacre, and he'd seen enough of those to last a lifetime. The storm raged until dawn. When the rain finally stopped, the world was gray and dripping, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and ozone. Jax opened his eyes to find the village stirring, warriors emerging from their huts, shaking off sleep, checking weapons. 2 guards came for him as the sun tried to burn through the clouds. They unlocked the cage, dragged him out into the mud, and shackled his wrists in front of him with iron cuffs that bit into his skin. He didn't resist. Resistance would have been stupid, and he'd used up his stupid quota for the week. They hauled him to the center of the village, where a crowd had gathered around a raised platform of split logs. Ilara stood at the front, arms crossed, watching him with that same unreadable expression. Behind her, an older warrior, gray-skinned, heavily scarred, wearing a cloak made from some kind of scaled hide, leaned on a staff and muttered something Jax couldn't hear. The guards shoved him forward. He stumbled, caught himself, and straightened. Mud caked his boots, his pants, his hands. He probably looked like hell, felt like it too. Ilara stepped down from the platform, boots splashing in the puddles, and stopped a few feet away. Close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her silver eyes. Close enough that he could hear the low rasp of her breathing. "You said you came to warn us," she said. Not a question, a challenge. He nodded. "Your chief, the one who rode out yesterday with the banners in the honor guard." Her jaw tightened. "What about him?" Jax turned, chains clinking, and pointed toward the ridge. "He's walking into a trap. The skull breakers don't parley. They slaughter. They've rigged the pass with explosives. When he reaches the midpoint, they'll blow the charges and bring the walls down on top of him. Then they'll pick off the survivors." Silence. The crowd shifted, murmuring, uncertain. Ilara's lip curled. "You think your weak eyes see farther than ours?" "I don't think. I know." He met her gaze, didn't blink. "I've seen them plant the charges. I know how they hunt. And unless you send someone to warn him, he's already dead." Her hand moved to the haft of her spear. For a moment, he thought she might run him through right there, just to shut him up. But she didn't. Instead, she turned to the older warrior. "What do you say, Kalen?" The old man spat into the mud. "I say he's a liar. Humans always are." "Maybe," Ilara said. She looked back at Jax, eyes narrowing. "Or maybe he's desperate. Desperate enough to tell the truth. Or desperate enough to lead us into a trap of his own. Then we'll find out." She turned to the crowd, raised her voice. "Send riders, fast ones. If the human's lying, we'll know by midday. If he's not..." She didn't finish. Didn't need to. The crowd broke apart, warriors scattering to their mounts. Within minutes, 3 riders were thundering toward the ridge, their banners snapping in the wind. Jax watched them go, heart pounding, and prayed they'd be fast enough. Ilara stepped closer. "If you're wrong," she said quietly, "I'll feed you to the dogs." Slowly. "If I'm wrong," he said, "you won't need to. The Skullbreakers will do it for you." She stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked away. The guards dragged him back to the cage. Hours crawled by like wounded animals. Jax sat in the mud, chains wrapped around his wrists, and watched the sky. The sun climbed higher, burning through the clouds, and the heat pressed down like a fist. Sweat dripped into his eyes. His throat felt like sandpaper. He didn't ask for water. Asking would have been pointless. Instead, he listened. The village was tense, waiting, every warrior on edge. Voices rose and fell, sharp and uncertain. Some argued for action, others for patience. A few suggested killing him now, just to be safe. Ilara's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "We wait." And they waited. The sun reached its zenith. Jax's vision started to blur at the edges. Exhaustion and dehydration dragging him down. He closed his eyes just for a moment, just to rest, and jerked awake to the sound of horns. Not victory horns, not the triumphant blast of warriors returning home. These were different, higher, sharper. The kind of sound that meant something had gone wrong. The village erupted. Warriors scrambled for weapons, shouting orders, cursing, running. Jax pushed himself to his feet, chains dragging, and stared toward the ridge. Fire. A column of smoke rose from the pass, thick and black, twisting into the sky like a serpent. Even from here, he could hear the rumble of falling rock, the distant screams of dying men. Ilara appeared at the edge of the cage, face pale, eyes wide. She didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there staring at the smoke, her hand clenched so tight around her spear that her knuckles had gone white. Then she turned to him. Her voice was barely a whisper. "You knew." He nodded. "How?" "Because I've seen them do it before." She looked back at the ridge, at the fire, at the smoke. Her father's banner, red and gold, proud and bright, was gone, swallowed by the flames. When she turned back to him, her eyes were wet. "He's dead," she said. Not a question, a fact. Jack said nothing. There was nothing to say. She stood there for a long moment, shaking, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Then she turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the cage. That night, the village burned candles for the dead. Jax watched the flames flicker through the bars, small and fragile, and thought about all the other flames he'd seen. All the other dead. He didn't sleep. Dawn came gray and cold. The candles had burned out, leaving only wax and ash. Jax opened his eyes to find Alara standing outside the cage, silent as a ghost. She looked different, older maybe, or just more broken. Her armor was off, replaced by a simple tunic stained with mud and blood. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, damp from the morning dew. She didn't speak, just stood there staring at him. Then she stepped closer, reaching through the bars. In her hand was a small military medkit, battered and worn, the kind soldiers carried in the field. She held it out toward him. He frowned. "What's this?" "You're bleeding." He looked down. She was right. His wrists were raw from the chains, the skin torn and weeping. He hadn't noticed, hadn't cared. "Keep it," he said. "I don't need it." "Yes, you do." She blinked, confused. Then she looked down at her own arm, at the deep gash running from elbow to wrist, still wet, still bleeding. She'd gotten it in the chaos yesterday, probably didn't even remember how. Jax pushed the med kit through the bars toward her. "Take it," he said quietly. She stared at the kit, then at him. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. "Why?" Her voice was raw, scraped thin. "Why help your enemy?" He leaned his head back against the post, closed his eyes. "Because I'm tired of watching people die when they could have lived." Silence. The kind that felt heavy, like something was breaking that couldn't be fixed. When he opened his eyes again, she was gone. But the med kit was gone too. Hours later, as the sun climbed higher and the heat pressed down, he heard movement outside the cage. Not guards, not warriors, just her. Alara sat in the shadow of the wall, back against the logs, her arm wrapped in clean bandages, the antiseptic from his kit. She didn't look at him, just stared at the ground, her jaw tight, her eyes distant. Jax waited. Patience was a skill he'd learned young. Finally she spoke. "The skull breakers will come." He nodded. "Yes." "When?" "Soon. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. But soon." She turned her head just slightly so she could see him through the bars. "How do you know?" "Because that's what they do. They break your spirit first, kill your leaders, burn your hope. Then they come for the rest." Her hand moved to her spear, fingers curling around the haft. "We'll fight." "You'll lose." Her eyes flashed. "You don't know that." "I do." He leaned forward, chains clinking. "Your wall, the one facing north, it's too weak. The logs are rotted through at the base. One good hit and it'll come down." She stared at him. Then slowly she turned to look at the northern wall. He was right. She stood, boots scraping against the dirt, and walked to the wall, pressed her hand against the wood. It gave just slightly, the logs shifting under her weight. She closed her eyes, breathed deep. "Fuck!" Jax almost smiled. Almost. She turned back to him, eyes hard. "If you're lying, I'm not. I'll kill you myself." "Fair enough." She opened her mouth to say something else, but stopped, tilted her head, listening. Drums. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. They echoed across the valley like a heartbeat, low and steady, growing louder with each passing second. Alara's face went pale. "They're coming," Jack said quietly. She looked at him, at the drums, at the northern wall. Then she ran. Night fell like smoke, thick and choking. The drums had stopped an hour ago, replaced by silence, the kind that made your skin crawl, the kind that meant something was waiting just beyond the edge of sight. Jack sat in the cage, chains wrapped around his wrists, and listened to the village prepare. Warriors moved through the darkness like shadows, checking weapons, reinforcing walls. Alara's voice rose above the rest, sharp and commanding, organizing defenses. The attack came from the north, exactly as he'd said. The wall exploded inward in a spray of splinters and flame. The skullbreakers poured through the gap, screaming. their weapons catching the firelight. Chaos. Pure, unfiltered chaos. Jax pressed himself against the back of the cage as warriors clashed around him, steel on steel. Blood sprayed across the mud. Bodies fell. The cage shook with every impact. Then he saw Alara fighting like lightning given form, her spear a blur of motion. She moved through the skull breakers like a storm, cutting them down. But there were too many. Jax shouted, his voice tearing through the noise. Your flank! Use the barrels! Ignite them! She turned, just for a second. Their eyes met. She understood. She sprinted toward him and skidded to a stop in front of the cage. Her hands fumbled at her belt, pulling free a ring of keys. She shoved one into the lock, twisted, and the cage door swung open. Jax grabbed a fallen spear and ran to the storage hut, kicked the door open, and started rolling barrels toward the breach. Alara was beside him a moment later. What are you doing? She shouted. Making a fire, he shouted back. He shoved the first barrel into the gap, grabbed a torch, and threw it. The barrel exploded in a wall of flame, cutting off the breach. Skull breakers screamed as the fire caught them. Jax rolled another barrel. Another. Together they turned the breach into a death trap. The skull breakers fell back. The village warriors rallied, driving them out into the darkness. By the time the last attacker fell, the sky was starting to lighten. Dawn crept over the horizon, pale and uncertain, and the village was silent except for the crackle of dying flames. Jax dropped to his knees beside Alara, breathless, burnt, his lungs screaming for air. She sat beside him, her spear across her lap, blood on her lips, staring at the smoldering wreckage. You could have escaped, she said quietly. He looked at her, at the scar on her jaw, the exhaustion in her eyes. You're my escape, he said. She turned to him, frowning. What does that mean? He didn't answer. Didn't need to. From somewhere beyond the walls, horns blew. Victory cries from survivors. They'd won. For now. Sunrise came slow and reluctant, the light gray and weak. Jax walked through the ashes, his boots crunching on charred wood, carrying something heavy wrapped in cloth. He moved carefully, deliberately, ignoring the stares that followed him. The village was half ruins, half alive. Bodies lay where they'd fallen, covered with blankets, waiting for the pyres. Warriors sat in clusters, bandaging wounds, sharpening blades. He made his way to the center of the village, where the council fire still burned. A crowd had gathered, maybe 50 warriors. They turned as he approached. One of them laughed. Look what the wind dragged in! Jax stopped before the fire, didn't speak, just knelt, unwrapped the bundle, and dropped its contents onto the ground. Silence. 2 spears lay in the dirt. The first was broken, snapped in half. The wood splintered, the iron tip bent. Red and gold ribbons hung from the haft, torn and filthy. The chief's spear. The second was whole. Black wood, iron tip. The blade etched with screaming faces. And along the haft, carved deep into the wood, a symbol, a skull with tally marks beneath it, counting deaths like trophies. The Skullbreaker warlord's spear. The crowd stared. Jax looked at Alara. She stood at the edge of the circle, her face unreadable. A message, he said quietly. No one laughed. The young warrior stepped forward, his face pale. Where did you... I found your chief in the pass, Jax said. What was left of him. And I found the warlord 2 kilometers south, running with the survivors. He's not running anymore. The warrior opened his mouth, closed it, sat down. Kalen, the old man with the staff, limped forward. His eyes were sharp, calculating. You killed him? Alone? Does it matter? Yes. Jax met his gaze. Then yes. Alone. Kalen studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and stepped back. Alara moved through the crowd, her boots scraping against the dirt, until she stood beside the fire. Beside Jax. The flames cast shadows across her face, making her look older, harder. She reached down, picked up the broken spear, and held it up. The light ran along its cracks, turning them into rivers of gold. This was my father's, she said. Her voice was steady, but Jax could hear the tremor underneath. He carried it for 30 years. Never broke. Never bent. She lowered it, her jaw tight. Until now. The crowd shifted, murmuring. Alara turned to them, her eyes blazing. His path led to death. Honor without caution. Pride without thought. She thrust the spear into the ground beside Jack's, so hard the earth cracked. Mine led to this man. Silence. The kind that felt like a held breath. She stepped closer to Jack's, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her. The tension coiled in her shoulders. Her voice dropped, softer now, but no less fierce. He brought us no chains, no lies, no false promises. She looked at the crowd, then back at him. Only a way to break them. The wind stilled. The fire crackled. One by one, the warriors knelt. First the young one with the broken spear, then others. Old, young, scarred, whole. They knelt in the dirt, their heads bowed, until only Kalen remained standing. The old man stared at Jax for a long moment. Then he smiled, a thin, dangerous smile, and knelt. Elora reached down, pulled Jax to his feet. Her hand was warm, strong, scarred. Choose, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Follow the broken path or forge a new one. No one moved. No one spoke. Then Alara turned to Jax, her voice dropping to a whisper only he could hear. Stay! It wasn't a command, it was a plea. He looked at her, at the fire reflected in her eyes, at the way her hand trembled in his, at the weight of everything she carried, and he nodded. The crowd rose one by one, and the village, what was left of it, exhaled. The days that followed were hard. Rebuilding always was. They burned the dead at sunset, the pyres lighting the sky in shades of orange and red. Warriors spoke names into the flames, their voices rough with grief, and watched as smoke carried their loved ones away. Jack stood at the edge of the circle, silent, respectful, and when Alara's hand found his, he didn't pull away. They rebuilt the northern wall, this time with stone instead of wood. Jack showed them how to reinforce the base, how to angle the structure to absorb impact, how to turn a weakness into a strength. Some of the warriors listened, others didn't, but enough did that the wall stood taller, stronger when they were done. He taught them other things too, how to set traps, how to read terrain, how to move silently, strike fast, disappear before the enemy knew what hit them. They learned quickly, adapting his methods to their own style, blending his knowledge with theirs until something new emerged. Something neither human nor alien, but both. Alara led them through it all, her voice steady, her presence a constant. She made hard decisions without flinching, cut through arguments with a word, carried the weight of leadership like it was a second skin. Jax watched her, fascinated and humbled, and wondered how someone could be so strong and so fragile at the same time. Late at night, when the village slept, they sat by the fire and talked, not about war or strategy or the next threat on the horizon, about smaller things, the taste of rain, the sound of wind through tall grass, the way light looked when it hit water just right. She told him about her father, about growing up in his shadow, trying to be the warrior he wanted, the daughter he needed, about the day she'd realized she'd never be enough, and the day she'd decided to stop trying. He told her about Earth, about cities made of glass and steel, about oceans that stretched forever, about a sky that was blue instead of gray. He didn't tell her why he'd left. Some wounds were too deep to share. One night she asked him the question he'd been dreading. What happens when the Skullbreakers come back? He stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. They'll come. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but they'll come. Can we stop them? Maybe, if you're smart, if you're lucky. He paused. If you're willing to do what needs to be done. She turned to him, her eyes sharp. What does that mean? He met her gaze. It means you can't fight them the way your father did. Head on, honor-bound, waiting for them to come to you. You have to take the fight to them. Hit them where they're weak, make them afraid. That's not our way. Then change your way or die. She flinched. He saw it. Just a flicker, just for a second. But it was there. I'm sorry, he said quietly. But it's the truth. She looked away, jaw tight. I know. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called, its cry sharp and mournful. Alara stood, brushing ash from her tunic. Tomorrow we scout their territory. See how many are left, where they're camped. Jax nodded. I'll come with you. You don't have to. I know. She smiled, small, tired, but real. Then get some sleep. We leave at dawn." They left before the sun rose, moving through the gray half-light like ghosts. 4 of them: Ilara, Jax, and 2 warriors named Ren and Kale. Ren was young, fast, eager to prove himself. Kale was older, quieter, with scars that told stories Jax didn't need to hear. They traveled light, carrying only weapons, water, and enough supplies for 2 days. The terrain was rough: rocky hills, narrow ravines, stretches of scrubland that offered no cover. Jax kept his eyes moving, scanning for movement, for tracks, for anything that looked wrong. By midday, they found the first signs: boot prints in the mud deep and fresh, broken branches, a campfire still warm, hastily abandoned. "They know we're here," Kale said quietly. Jax nodded. "Yeah. How many?" "Hard to say. Maybe a dozen. Maybe more." Ilara crouched beside the fire, her fingers brushing the ashes. "They're moving fast, running, not hunting." "Good," Jax said. "Means they're scared." Ren grinned. "Good." They followed the trail deeper into the hills, moving carefully, staying low. The sun climbed higher, the heat pressing down, and sweat soaked through Jax's shirt. His legs ached, his lungs burned. But he didn't slow down. They found the camp at sunset. It was tucked into a narrow canyon, hidden from view, protected on 3 sides by sheer rock walls. Tents clustered around a central fire, maybe 20 of them, and warriors moved between them, checking weapons, eating, talking in low voices. Jax counted heads. 23, maybe 25. More than he'd hoped, fewer than he'd feared. Ilara crouched beside him, her eyes narrow. "We can't take them. Not head on." "No," Jax agreed, "but we can make them think we can." She frowned. "How?" He pointed to the canyon walls, to the loose rocks perched on the edges, waiting to fall. "We hit them from above. Trigger a rock slide, bury half of them, scatter the rest. Then we pick off the survivors." Ren's grin widened. "I like it." Kyle nodded slowly. "It could work." Ilara looked at Jax, her expression unreadable. "And if it doesn't? Then we run." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Let's do it." They moved into position as the sun set, climbing the canyon walls, stepping carefully. Jax took the north side, Ilara the south, with Ren and Kale spread between them. The skullbreakers below were oblivious, laughing, eating. Jax found a good spot, a cluster of boulders, loose and heavy, perched on a narrow ledge. He wedged his spear under the largest one, tested the leverage, and waited. The signal came as the last light faded, a single sharp whistle from Ilara's side. Jax heaved. The boulder shifted, groaned, and tumbled over the edge. It hit the slope with a sound like thunder, dislodging more rocks, more boulders, and the whole hillside came apart. The skullbreakers looked up just in time to see the wall of stone roaring down, and then there was no time for anything else. The rock slide hit like a fist, crushing tents, burying bodies. Screams filled the canyon, sharp and panicked, and those who survived scrambled for weapons, for cover. Jax didn't give them time to think. He grabbed his spear and slid down the slope, boots skidding on loose rock, and hit the canyon floor running. Ilara was already there, her blade flashing in the firelight. Ren and Kale followed, moving like shadows, and together they tore through the survivors. It was over in minutes. When the last skullbreaker fell, the canyon was silent except for the crackle of flames and the low moan of the wind. Jax stood in the center of the carnage, breathing hard, blood on his hands. Ilara walked over, her face streaked with dirt and blood, her eyes bright and fierce. "They'll know," she said quietly. "They'll know we did this." "Good," Jax said. "Let them be afraid." She smiled, sharp, dangerous. "I think I'm starting to like your way." He almost laughed. Almost. They left the canyon as the moon rose, moving quickly, covering their tracks. By dawn, they were back at the village, exhausted, bloodied, but alive. The warriors who met them didn't cheer, just nodded, grim and respectful, and let them pass. Ilara found Jax by the fire that night, sitting alone, staring into the flames. She didn't speak, just sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Thank you," she said quietly. He glanced at her. "For what?" "For staying." He looked back at the fire. "Where else would I go?" She didn't answer. Didn't need to. They sat in silence as the night deepened, and somewhere in the distance the wind carried the sound of drums. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. Ilara's hand moved to her spear. Jax didn't look up. Not tonight. They're regrouping, licking their wounds. How long? A week, maybe 2. She exhaled slowly. Not long enough. No, he agreed, but long enough to prepare. She turned to him, her eyes searching his face. You think we can win? He thought about the canyon, about the bodies buried under stone, about the fear he'd seen in the survivors' eyes as they ran. I think you can survive, he said, if you're willing to fight dirty. Her jaw tightened. I am. He believed her. The week that followed was a blur of motion and sweat. Jax pushed the warriors harder than they'd ever been pushed, teaching them tactics that felt wrong, dishonorable, brutal, ambush techniques, throat strikes, how to kill silently, quickly. Some resisted, called him a coward, a snake. Ilara shut them down with a look. He's keeping you alive, she said, her voice cold as iron. Learn or die, your choice. They learned. Jax showed them how to use the terrain, how to funnel enemies into kill zones, how to create choke points. He taught them to fight at night, when their blue skin blended into shadows. He taught them to be ghosts. In the distance beyond the ridge, a single torch moved, slow, deliberate, watching. Ilara absorbed it all like a sponge, her mind sharp, her instincts honed by years of combat. She adapted his methods faster than anyone, combining them with her own brutal efficiency until she became something terrifying, a warrior who fought with both honor and cunning. Jax watched her train one afternoon, sparring with 3 warriors at once, moving like water, striking like lightning, and felt something shift in his chest, something dangerous. She caught his eye across the training ground and smiled, not the sharp smile she wore in battle, but something softer. He looked away. Smoke drifted across the valley, gray, thin, from no visible source. That night, she found him on the wall, staring out at the darkness. You're avoiding me, she said. I'm keeping watch. Liar! He almost smiled. Almost. She leaned against the wall beside him, close enough that he could feel her warmth. What happened to you? She asked quietly. On your world. What made you come here? He was silent for a long time. Then he spoke. I killed a child. His voice was flat, empty. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong call. I pulled the trigger and a kid died. They cleared me, said it was justified, but I knew it was wrong, and I couldn't live with that. Ilara didn't flinch, didn't pull away. She reached out, her hand covering his where it rested on the wall, and squeezed once. Silent validation. On the mountainside, fire bloomed briefly, then disappeared. They stood together on the wall as the night deepened, 2 broken people holding each other up. And for the first time in a long time, Jax didn't feel quite so alone. The attack came on the 8th day. Not from the north this time, from the east. They hit at dawn, when the light was gray and uncertain. 20 warriors, maybe more, moving fast and silent. But Jax had expected it. He'd placed sentries on every approach, hidden in positions the skullbreakers wouldn't think to check. When the first warrior crossed the perimeter, a whistle went up, low, sharp, urgent, and the village exploded into motion. Warriors poured from their huts, weapons ready. Ilara was at the front, her spear in hand, her voice cutting through the chaos. East wall, form up, archers, high ground, move! The skullbreakers hit the wall with a roar, axes and hammers slamming into stone, but the wall held, and the warriors were ready. Arrows rained down from the rooftops, spears thrust through gaps in the wall finding flesh. The skullbreakers fell back, regrouped, charged again, and again the wall held. Jax moved through the chaos like a shadow, his spear flashing. He didn't think, didn't hesitate, just moved, struck, killed. Ilara fought beside him, their movements synchronized, instinctive. When he struck high, she struck low. When she pushed forward, he covered her flank. They moved like they'd been fighting together for years, and the skullbreakers fell before them. By the time the sun fully rose, the attack was over. Bodies lay scattered across the dirt. The wounded were carried inside, the dead covered with blankets. The living stood in stunned silence, breathing hard. They'd won. Again. Ilara walked through the aftermath, checking warriors, speaking quiet words of encouragement. When she reached Jax, she stopped, her eyes sweeping over him. "You're hurt," she said, nodding to his arm. He looked down. Blood soaked through his sleeve, dark and wet. He hadn't noticed. "It's nothing," he said. "It's not nothing." She grabbed his arm, her touch firm but gentle, and pulled him toward the medical hut. "Come on." He didn't argue. Inside the hut, she cleaned the wound with efficiency born of practice, her hands steady. The cut was deep but clean. A blade had caught him during the fight. "You're lucky," she said, wrapping it with bandages. "Am I?" She looked up at him, frowning. "What kind of question is that?" He didn't answer. She tied off the bandage, her fingers lingering on his skin for just a moment longer than necessary. Then she stepped back. "We can't keep doing this," she said quietly. "I know. They'll keep coming. Bigger numbers, better weapons. Eventually we'll run out of warriors, out of luck." "I know." She crossed her arms, jaw tight. "So what do we do?" Jax met her gaze. "We end it, before they do." "How?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "We take the fight to them, find their main camp, their stronghold, hit them where it hurts most." She stared at him. "That's suicide." "Maybe. Or maybe it's the only way you survive." "You're talking about 20 warriors going up against hundreds. I'm talking about 20 warriors who know how to fight smart going up against hundreds who think they've already won." He stood, ignoring the pain in his arm. "Fear is a weapon. We've already planted the seed. Now we water it." Ilara was silent for a long moment, her eyes distant, calculating. Then she nodded slowly. "When do we leave?" 3 days. Give the wounded time to recover. Give everyone time to prepare. And if they attack again before then? They won't. We hurt them too badly. They'll wait. Regroup. That's when we strike. She studied his face, searching for something. Doubt, maybe. Fear. But she didn't find it. "You're insane," she said. He smiled, small, tired but real. "Probably." She almost smiled back. Almost. The next 3 days passed in a haze of preparation. Warriors sharpened weapons, gathered supplies, said quiet goodbyes. Some wrote letters. Some prayed. Some just sat in silence, staring at nothing. Jack spent the time scouting routes, mapping terrain, memorizing every detail of the land between the village and the Skullbreaker stronghold. It was 40 kilometers to the northwest, carved into the side of a mountain, protected by sheer cliffs and narrow passes. A fortress, a tomb. On the third night, Ilara called a council. 20 warriors gathered around the fire, the best they had. They sat in a circle, faces grim, eyes hard, and waited. Ilara stood. "You know what we're doing. You know the risk." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "I won't lie to you. Some of us won't come back. Maybe none of us will." Silence. The fire crackled. "But if we don't do this, if we sit here and wait, they'll come for us, and they'll keep coming until there's nothing left." Her voice hardened. "I'd rather die fighting than live waiting to die." Murmurs of agreement. Nods. Ren stood. "When do we leave?" "Dawn," Ilara said. "Then let's get drunk tonight," Ren said with a grin. "If we're going to die, might as well do it with a hangover." Laughter. Rough, bitter, but real. They drank that night, not to excess, but enough to take the edge off. Jack sat on the edge of the circle, watching, listening, feeling the weight of what was coming pressed down on his shoulders. Ilara found him as the fire burned low, and the others drifted off to sleep. She sat beside him, a flask in her hand, and offered it. He took a drink. The liquid burned, going down. "What is this?" he asked. "Fermented grain. We call it courage." He almost laughed. Almost. They sat in silence for a while, passing the flask back and forth, watching the embers glow. "I'm scared," Ilara said quietly. He looked at her. She was staring into the fire, her face unreadable. "Good," he said. "Means you're smart. Are you scared?" He thought about it, about the mountain, the fortress, the hundreds of warriors waiting to kill them. "Yeah," he said. "I am." She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Then why are you doing this?" He held her gaze. "Because you asked me to." Something shifted in her expression. She reached out, her hand finding his, her fingers interlacing with his. If we die tomorrow, she said softly, I want you to know. Don't, he interrupted. Don't say it. Why not? Because saying it makes it real, and if it's real, it hurts more when it ends. She smiled, sad, small, beautiful. Maybe that's the point. She leaned in, and he didn't pull away. Their lips met, soft and hesitant at first, then deeper, more certain. She tasted like smoke and courage and something he couldn't name. And for just a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them. The fire, the night. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. Tomorrow, she whispered. Tomorrow, he agreed. They left before dawn, moving through the gray half-light like ghosts. 20 warriors armed and silent, their faces painted with ash, their weapons wrapped to muffle sound. Jax led them northwest, following routes he'd scouted, avoiding the main trails, keeping to the shadows. The terrain grew rougher as they climbed. The sun rose slowly, burning through the clouds, and the heat pressed down. No one complained. No one spoke. They just moved step after step, hour after hour, until the mountain loomed before them like a black tooth against the sky. The Skullbreaker stronghold was carved into the southern face, a network of caves and tunnels connected by narrow walkways. Sentries stood at the main entrance, weapons ready. Jax led the group to a ridge overlooking the stronghold and signaled a halt. They crouched in the rocks, breathing hard, and stared at their target. How do we get in? Kyle asked quietly. Jax pointed to the eastern side where a narrow ledge led to a secondary entrance. Smaller, less guarded. On the stone archway above it, carved deep into the rock, was the same symbol he'd seen on the warlord's spear, a skull with tally marks beneath it. There, 2 sentries. We take them out quietly, move through the side tunnels, hit them from the inside. Ilara nodded. And once we're in, we burn everything we can, kill everyone we see, and get out before they organize. Ren grinned. Simple. It won't be simple, Jack said flatly. Stick together, watch each other's backs, and don't stop moving. The moment you stop, you die. Silence, grim nods. Let's move, Ilara said. They descended the ridge. The ledge was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, and the drop on the left was sheer and fatal. Jax led the way, his heart pounding. The 2 sentries stood at the entrance, talking in low voices, oblivious. Jax signaled to Ilara. She nodded, drew her knife, and moved. She was on them before they could scream, her blade flashing twice. They fell without a sound, and she dragged their bodies out of sight. The group slipped into the tunnel, weapons ready. The interior was dark, lit only by torches set at intervals along the walls. The air was thick, stale, smelling of smoke and sweat and blood. They moved deeper, avoiding patrols, slipping through shadows. The tunnels branched and twisted, and Jax navigated by memory and instinct. They emerged into a large chamber, a central hub where multiple tunnels converge. Warriors moved through it, carrying supplies, sharpening weapons. Dozens of them. Jax pointed to the barrels stacked against the far wall. Oil. Pointed to the torches, pointed to the exits. Ilara signaled to the others, spreading them out, positioning them. Then she looked at Jax and nodded. He stepped into the chamber, raised his spear and threw it. The spear hit the nearest barrel with a crack, punching through the wood, and oil poured out. A Skullbreaker turned, saw him, and Ilara's arrow took him in the throat. Chaos. The warriors poured into the chamber from all sides, striking fast. Jax grabbed a torch, threw it at the oil, and the floor erupted in flames. Fire roared up the walls, catching barrels, turning the chamber into an inferno. The Skullbreakers screamed, scrambling for weapons, for exits. But the flames cut them off, and Jax's warriors were everywhere. Jax fought like a machine, his movements precise, efficient. Bodies fell around him, the air thick with smoke and screams. Ilara was beside him, her blade flashing. Together they carved through the chaos, driving deeper into the stronghold, leaving fire and death in their wake. But there were too many. For every Skullbreaker they killed, 2 more appeared. The tunnels filled with warriors, pouring in from all directions. Fall back, Ilara shouted. Now! They ran, boots pounding on stone, flames licking at their heels. Jax grabbed a torch, threw it at a support beam, and the tunnel collapsed behind them, cutting off pursuit. They kept running, following exits Jax had memorized. They burst out of the mountain into blinding sunlight, gasping, bleeding, alive. Behind them, smoke poured from the stronghold's entrances, thick and black, and screams echoed from within. "Move!" Jack shouted. "They'll be right behind us!" They ran down the mountain. By the time they reached the valley floor, they'd lost 3 warriors. Ren took an arrow to the leg. Cal's arm was broken. Everyone was bleeding, exhausted. But they'd done it. They'd hit the skull breakers where it hurt most. Ilara collapsed to her knees, breathing hard, her face streaked with soot and blood. She looked up at Jax, her eyes wide, disbelieving. "We did it," she whispered. He nodded, too exhausted to speak. "We damn did it." The journey back took 2 days. They moved slowly, carefully, carrying the wounded, avoiding patrols. By the time they reached the village, they were barely recognizable, covered in blood and ash, limping, half dead, but alive. The village erupted in cheers when they saw them, warriors pouring out to meet them, embracing them, lifting them up. Jax let himself be carried along, too tired to resist, too numb to feel anything. Ilara found him later that night, sitting alone by the fire, staring at nothing. She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and handed him a flask. He drank, didn't taste it. "You saved us," she said quietly. He shook his head. "You saved yourselves. I just showed you how. Don't do that. Don't diminish what you did." He looked at her, at the exhaustion in her eyes, at the weight she carried, at the way she held herself like she might break at any moment. "I'm tired," he said quietly. "I know. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this." She took his hand, her grip warm and strong. "Then don't. Stay here. With me. With us. Let this be home." He wanted to. God, he wanted to. But the weight of everything he'd done, everyone he'd killed, pressed down on him like a stone. "I don't deserve this," he said. "None of us do." She squeezed his hand. "But we take it anyway. Because the alternative is dying alone." He closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of her beside him, the weight of her hand in his, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself hope. The days that followed were strange, peaceful almost. The Skullbreakers didn't come, didn't attack, didn't even send scouts. The stronghold still smoked on the horizon, a black scar against the mountain, and the silence felt like a held breath. Jax helped rebuild, fixed walls, trained warriors, sat with Ilara by the fire and talked about nothing and everything. Slowly, painfully, he began to feel like maybe, just maybe, he could stay. On the 7th day, scouts returned with news. The Skullbreakers had abandoned their stronghold, scattered into the hills. Some had fled to other tribes, others had simply disappeared. The threat was gone. The village celebrated that night, drinking and laughing and dancing around the fire. Warriors told stories of the battle, embellishing details, turning fear into legend. Jax sat on the edge of the circle watching, feeling both part of it and separate from it. Ilara found him as the celebration wound down, the fire burning low, the others drifting off to sleep. She sat beside him, her hand finding his, and they sat in comfortable silence. "What now?" she asked quietly. He thought about it, about Earth, about the life he'd left behind, about the guilt he carried, about the possibility of something new. "I don't know," he said honestly. She smiled. "Good, neither do I. We can figure it out together." He looked at her, at the woman who'd threatened to kill him, who'd fought beside him, who'd shown him that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't beyond saving. Together, he agreed. And for the first time in a long time, he meant it. The next morning, Jax woke to find the village already stirring. Warriors moved through the streets, carrying supplies, checking weapons, preparing for something. He found Ilara at the center of the village, standing before a crowd, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "We've won," she said. "We've survived. But survival isn't enough. We need to rebuild, stronger, smarter. We need to make sure this never happens again." The crowd murmured agreement. She turned, her eyes finding Jax in the crowd. "And we have someone who can teach us how." All eyes turned to him. Jax froze, caught off guard, uncertain. Ilara held out her hand. "Will you help us?" He stared at her hand, at the scars, at the strength, at the hope. Then he stepped forward and took it. The crowd erupted in cheers. Weeks passed, then months. The village grew stronger, more organized, more prepared. Jax taught them everything he knew: tactics, strategy, engineering. They built stronger walls, better defenses, systems for communication and supply. They trained relentlessly, turning fear into discipline, chaos into order. And slowly, painfully, Jax began to heal. The nightmares didn't stop, probably never would. But they became less frequent, less vivid. The weight he carried became easier to bear. And every morning, when he woke to find Alara beside him, he remembered that maybe, just maybe, he deserved this. One night, as they sat by the fire, Alara turned to him. "I have something for you," she said. She reached behind her and pulled out a spear. Not just any spear, his spear, the one he'd thrown in the stronghold, the one he thought he'd lost. But it had been repaired, the shaft reinforced, the blade sharpened, and along the haft someone had carved symbols, words in her language that he couldn't read. "What does it say?" he asked. She smiled. "Home." He stared at the spear, at the symbols, at the care that had gone into repairing it. His throat tightened. "Thank you," he managed. She leaned in, kissed him softly. "Thank you for staying." The day came when messengers arrived from neighboring villages, seeking alliance, seeking knowledge, seeking the warriors who'd defeated the Skullbreakers. Ilara stood before them, proud and strong, and spoke of unity, of cooperation, of building something better. And beside her stood Jax, no longer a prisoner, no longer an outsider, but something more. A partner, a teacher, a man who'd found his way home. The council met that evening to discuss the alliances, to plan the future. Warriors gathered in the great hall, voices rising and falling, debating, arguing, dreaming. Jax sat beside Alara, listening, offering advice when asked, content to let her lead. As the meeting wound down and warriors began to file out, Alara stood. The room fell silent. She walked to the center of the hall, where two spears stood planted in the ground, the broken spear of her father and the whole spear of the Skullbreaker warlord. She placed her hand on each, her eyes sweeping across the assembled warriors. "My father's path led to death," she said quietly, her voice carrying in the silence. "Honor without caution, pride without thought. I loved him, but I will not follow him." She pulled the broken spear from the ground, held it up so everyone could see. "This spear is broken, but a broken thing can still have value if we learn from it." She set it aside carefully, then turned to the other spear, the one Jax had taken from the warlord. "And this spear was my enemy's. But an enemy's weapon can become our own if we're brave enough to claim it." She pulled it from the ground, then turned to Jax, held it out to him. He stood slowly, uncertain, and took it. Alara turned back to the crowd, her voice rising. "His path led him here, to us, to me." She moved to stand beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "He brought us no chains, no lies, no false promises, only a way to break them." The crowd was silent, waiting. She reached down, picked up her father's broken spear, and held it alongside the whole one Jax now carried. "We honor the past," she said, "but we choose the future." She thrust both spears into the ground, side by side. "Choose," she said, her voice echoing through the hall. "Follow the broken path, or forge a new one." The wind outside picked up, whistling through the gaps in the walls. The fire crackled. No one moved. Then one by one the warriors stood. First Ren, limping but grinning. Then Kale, his broken arm still in a sling. Then the others, old, young, scarred, whole. They stood in silent acknowledgement, not of submission, but of choice, of change. Ilara looked at Jax, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and smiled. "Stay," she whispered, so only he could hear. He looked at her, at the woman who'd become his partner, his anchor, his home, at the warriors who'd become his family, at the village that had taken him in when he had nothing. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, and he meant it. The celebration that followed was quiet, intimate. Warriors gathered around the fire, sharing food and drink, telling stories, laughing. Jax sat with Alara, their hands intertwined, and watched the flames dance. Somewhere in the distance, drums echoed, not the drums of war, but the drums of celebration, of life, of hope. The Skullbreakers were gone. The village was safe. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jax felt at peace. Ilara leaned her head on his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" He smiled. "How lucky I am." She laughed softly. "The man who walked into a cage to warn his enemies thinks he's lucky. Maybe I am." She lifted her head, looked at him with those silver gray eyes that had once promised death and now promised something far more dangerous. "Love. Maybe we both are," she said. And as the fire burned and the night deepened and the world turned, Jax Reeve, soldier, exile, survivor, finally allowed himself to believe it. He was home.